Okay, let's go over identifying workloads that don't require migration. Now, like a few different lessons in this objective, I'm not sure I agree with the phrasing or concept of this topic. In this case, what does it mean for a workload not to require migration? It makes more sense for us to say we're going to identify workloads that we're not able to migrate, or that we face challenges in migrating. None of the workloads technically need to be migrated if you don't want to migrate them. To me and to Wikipedia, data migration is the process of transferring data between computer systems. So migration is not to be taken lightly. In this case, the assumption would be that we're transferring from either an on-premise solution or some non-Microsoft solution to Office 365. Possibly we could also be migrating from one Office 365 tenant to another, but I don't believe that that's what this topic covers. So let's start off with talking about what can be migrated. Well, we can migrate to Exchange the following: mailboxes, archived email, calendars, contacts, public folders, distribution lists. We could also migrate non-Exchange email via IMAP and POP, but in this case only mail folders, not contacts and calendars, or at least not without third-party tools or PST files. Migration to OneDrive for Business Online can be done from an on-premise solution such as SharePoint, or from regular files and folders which can be copied to the OneDrive for Business folders. SharePoint Online can be used as a destination to migrate team sites from on-premise solutions as well. Or individual files and or lists and resources can also be migrated to new team sites that are set up on SharePoint Online. Now for Skype, any existing on-premise Skype for Business or Link users can be migrated to Skype for Business Online as well. So when it comes to Exchange, when do we want to migrate and when do we not want to migrate? Well, if we're going to move these users to Exchange Online and they need access to historical emails, they'll need to be migrated. If they're new users, then maybe they can be provisioned directly into Office 365 and don't require a mailbox on-premise. Also, if they're not planning to move to Exchange Online, then of course we don't need to migrate them either. For archives, it's a similar story. If I need archived emails, you may need to migrate those archived folders to Exchange Online. There is, however, more gotchas with archive, and many archive solutions are more difficult to migrate. You'll have to investigate the migration path for your archive software to make sure it's possible, feasible, and whether it's worth it. In fact, archive is one of the hardest things to migrate to Office 365, so definitely do your due diligence there. Calendars and contacts are migrated with mailboxes when migrating from an Exchange on-premise solution. If, however, you're migrating from a non-Exchange environment and using IMAP or POP, you'll need to find another way of migrating calendars and contacts, and this may require third-party tools, or it can be done with PST files as well. Public folders are still around and have not gone anywhere, although Microsoft has tried to kill them a few times. They did, however, undergo a transformation in Exchange 2013, where you can now convert them from legacy public folder databases to public folder mailboxes. Public folder mailboxes can be migrated or moved to Exchange Online, however the legacy public folder databases cannot. Therefore, if you're unable to convert to public folder mailboxes, either because you don't want to or because you don't have Exchange 2013, you'll need to maintain these public folders in your on-premise environment. And this means you'll be running an Exchange hybrid environment until you can convert the public folders or remove the need for them. Distribution lists can be migrated to Office 365 groups, but only if they're eligible, and this means that they cannot be nested distribution lists or managed distribution lists, and all the members of the groups will have to have Exchange Online mailboxes. Now, there are some distinct advantages to Office 365 groups, including having their own mailbox, but just know that you can always create these groups from scratch as well. When migrating to OneDrive for Business, make sure that you're not trying to migrate files that are unsupported, and this can be files that are too large or have invalid file names, or if you try to migrate too many files at once, you could run into some limitations there as well. SharePoint team sites can be migrated to SharePoint Online through a number of methods. However, realistically, the migration process is not ideal in a number of ways. You may wish to operate in a hybrid environment with both on-premise and online servers, or you may wish to recreate the sites and copy the content over. However, you may lose some metadata such as created by dates. It's recommended that you seek out help from Microsoft or a Microsoft partner in determining the best way to migrate your SharePoint content, especially if you're not that familiar with it. Skype for Business and Link users can be migrated to Skype for Business Online servers, and you can operate in a hybrid environment here as well. There are a few limitations with this, such as not being able to coexist with Skype for Business, Link 2010, and Link 2013 servers all operating simultaneously. You obviously cannot migrate to Skype for Business Online if you're not licensed for the product under your Office 365 subscription. Some additional considerations when migrating are as follows. Make sure you're not migrating any data or any encryption level or any services that are not supported or will be out of compliance with regulations in your country or area. Also know that with Exchange Online, you can't use any third-party add-ons. Therefore, if you have a need for third-party add-ons on the Exchange servers, you may need to maintain on-premise Exchange servers, at least for the Exchange roles in which you require the third-party add-ons for. You cannot install third-party software onto the Exchange Online servers. There are also considerations for the size of the mailboxes and the size of email attachments. There's a 50 gigabyte limit to the mailboxes in Exchange Online, so you cannot migrate mailboxes that exceed that limit. There's also a 150 megabyte limit on message size, which includes email attachments. However, this is set to 25 megabytes as default, so if you want the 150 megabyte limit, you'll need to raise that amount before beginning migration. Exchange Online also only allows a certain frequency of mail to be sent in a given time. Therefore, if you're using these mail accounts for any blast or marketing distributions, you run the risk of exceeding the threshold of sent messages allowed, so you might need to keep these accounts on-premise or with a third party. Email archive software that uses stubbing will most likely need to have those messages recalled onto active storage before it can be sent over for migration. For some organizations, this poses a problem as they do not have enough active storage to recall all those messages before migration. It can also take several weeks or several months to recall all those messages. Okay, so let's look at some of the migration limitations for the various services such as Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive for Business. Okay, let's take a look at some of the limitations of these online servers. Now, there's not really one repository to go and find these limitation documents. You just kind of have to search for it, Search for Exchange online limits or SharePoint online limits or Skype online limits and so forth. And this one is OneDrive limitations. So there's a lot here, and we're not going to go through all of this. Just know here initially that I thought this was 250 addresses in the address books, but what they're saying is that the limit is 250 address books, the actual books themselves. So keep note of that. And here's your 50 gigabyte active mailbox limit. It's pretty much across the board, kiosk being the exception here. And if we keep going down, we get some capacity alerts. This is where the warning and the prohibit sending thresholds are. We have some folder limits here, maximum number of messages. And if we keep going down, we reach, here we go, the file size limit here. So the subject length limit, the file size limit, and so forth. So here's that 150 megabytes. And this is not only the maximum attachment size, it's actually the whole message size. So, but generally the message itself is very small. It's the attachments that take up the most space. But what it's really saying here is that it's not a single attachment that can't exceed 150, but the sum of all the attachments and the text in the email also can't all exceed 150. And down here you see on the notes it says that it's actually a custom limit between 1 megabyte and 150 megabytes, but the default is set at 25, or at least it was last time I checked. So if you want the 150, you'll have to go in and change that in the Exchange admin center. I also wanted to come down here to the recipient rate limit. So it says here to discourage the delivery of unsolicited bulk messages, Exchange Online has recipient limits that prevent users from sending large volumes of email. And then down here it says that if you have legitimate need for this, you should use a third-party provider that specializes in these services. And that's good advice whether you're using Exchange on-premise or Exchange Online. If you are sending out, very massive blasts of email, you might want to think about using a third party anyway. It does put stress on your network, and it can cause your mail server and your IP addresses to get a bad reputation. So it's just not necessarily a good idea. But here are the actual limits. So 10,000 per day, it looks like, is pretty much the recipient rate limit, and 500 recipients at a time. Is that what that is? 500 recipients at a time. This is the maximum number of recipients allowed, yeah, and a single email. And then recipient proxy address limits, and then message rate limit, 30 messages per minute. So, go through these documents. We're not going to have time to go through all these, but here are the various limits for Exchange, which to me is the most important one. As far as SharePoint Online limits, Here you have the different storage limits, and I find that SharePoint's pretty forgiving in its limits. Number of users per tenant, 500,000. File attachment size limit 250. And then if we come over here to the OneDrive, here's some interesting things. So you can't have a file that's more than 10 gigabytes, 30 million documents, invalid characters. None of and these are pretty standard for Windows, so you won't have to worry about that. And these particular strings aren't supported in OneDrive for Business either. And if you're familiar with IT, you might be able to recognize some of these and determine why. You also can't create folders that have these names because they're reserved as well. Okay, and then we'll come over here to Skype for Business. And one thing you'll notice about the Skype for Business is that there's generally no difference between the plans, and there's no difference between the on-premise server as well as the online services. So if you have a working on-premise environment for Lync or Skype for Business, chances are you're not going to run into limitations when you move to your online service, because there's literally no variance between any of the plans or what's supported with an on-site server versus what's supported with the online plans. And, I never went over this, but a lot of the plans seem to have Plan 1 and Plan 2. There's two different plans. Generally speaking, the Plan 2 comes with the more advanced capabilities. E5 generally has the Plan 2. So in Skype's case, we talked about E5 having the ability to integrate with the public telephone network and to do some additional features. So some additional integration with PBX systems and IP telephony and voice over IP. So that's going to be your Plan 2 there. But none of the limits seem to change between Plan 1 and Plan 2 anyway. So that's it. That's the limits. Again, just make sure that you're not surpassing any of these limits. Plan out your migration. Seek out a partner if you require it. And decide what you're going to be running online or on-premise or a hybrid between the two. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Okay, next up, running the Office 365 health readiness and connectivity checks.